Long before sharks took over the seas as apex predators, the oceans were home to creatures that looked like something out of science fiction. These monsters were unlike anything we see today. They were armored, gigantic, and often terrifying in both design and behavior. Their time came hundreds of millions of years ago, in an ancient world where life was still experimenting with different forms. To understand how sharks became kings of the seas, we first need to travel back to the Paleozoic era, a time when the first true predators dominated the oceans, long before any shark had appeared. The story begins more than 500 million years ago, during the Cambrian period. The oceans then were not filled with whales, dolphins, or even fish as we know them. Instead, the sea swarmed with strange invertebrates, armored worms, and bizarre animals that would look alien to us today. Among them was one of the earliest super predators, a creature called Anomalocaris. This name means unusual shrimp, but Anomalocaris was far scarier than a shrimp. It could grow over 3 feet long, making it a giant compared to the tiny creatures of its time. It had sharp, spiny appendages near its mouth that it used to grab prey, and a circular jawline with teeth plates that looked like a rotating saw blade. With large compound eyes and a flexible body, it hunted trilobites, the dominant armored animals of the Cambrian seas. In many ways, Anomalocaris was the first ocean monster, ruling at a time when life was still in its early experimental stage. As time moved on into the Ordovician period, around 485 million years ago, the oceans changed again. New predators rose to power. The most terrifying of them were the orthocones, relatives of modern squids and octopuses. Imagine a squid with a long, straight shell, stretching over 20 feet in length. These orthocones drifted through the seas, using jet propulsion to move. With tentacles to seize prey and beaks strong enough to crack shells, they were the top hunters of their age. For nearly 200 million years, orthocones dominated the oceans, striking fear into trilobites, smaller mollusks, and primitive fish. Their long shells were not only weapons but also tools of stability, allowing them to float and hunt with precision. Before sharks had even evolved, these giant-shelled cephalopods were the true rulers of the sea. But evolution never stands still. Around 430 million years ago, during the Silurian period, fish began to rise. At first, these were jawless fish, armored with bony plates that covered their heads and bodies like natural shields. They were slow, clumsy swimmers, but they marked the beginning of a new chapter in ocean history. Some of them, like the heterostracans, were bottom dwellers that filtered food from the seabed. Others had simple sucking mouths but lacked the speed and agility to dominate. Still, their bony armor gave them protection against predators like orthocones, and over time, the balance of power began to shift. By the Devonian period, around 419 million years ago, the oceans became far more dangerous. This era is often called the Age of Fishes, because fish exploded in diversity and size. Jawed fish appeared, changing the game forever. With real jaws, they could bite, tear, and crush prey in ways earlier animals could not. Among these were placoderms, the armored giants of the Devonian seas. Placoderms had bony plates covering their heads and shoulders, giving them the look of underwater tanks. The most famous of them was Dunkleosteus, a predator that could grow up to 30 feet long. With jaws lined not with teeth, but with sharp bony blades, Dunkleosteus could slice through almost anything, from other fish to armored prey. Its bite force was among the strongest of any animal that has ever lived. For millions of years, Dunkleosteus and its relatives ruled the seas without rival, becoming some of the most fearsome ocean monsters in history. Placoderms were not alone in the Devonian seas. Alongside them lived early sharks, though they were nothing like the sharks we know today. These primitive sharks were smaller, less developed, and far from being the dominant predators. In fact, during this time, sharks were overshadowed by placoderms and other armored fish. The Devonian was truly the time when armored giants like Dunkleosteus ruled supreme, while sharks waited in the background, slowly evolving their weapons for the future. Another group that thrived in the Devonian seas were the lobe-finned fish, ancestors of both lungfish and the first land vertebrates. Some of these fish grew large and developed powerful jaws, but they were more important as evolutionary stepping stones than as rulers of the oceans. The true power still rested with placoderms and giant cephalopods. In fact, cephalopods remained important predators throughout this time, though they no longer held the crown as firmly as before. The rise of fish with jaws meant that armored predators had a new level of competition. Yet the reign of the placoderms was not eternal. By the end of the Devonian, about 360 million years ago, mass extinction struck the oceans. Many of the armored giants disappeared forever. The once powerful Dunkleosteus vanished, leaving behind a gap in the food chain. And it was in this gap that sharks began to grow stronger. Over the next millions of years, sharks would refine their skeletons, develop sharper teeth, and become faster swimmers. But before they could dominate, another group of monsters would take their turn ruling the seas. In the Carboniferous period, starting around 359 million years ago, giant sea scorpions known as eurypterids shared the oceans with sharks and fish. Some of these scorpions reached over 8 feet in length, using massive claws to grab prey. They were not true rulers of the open seas, but in shallow waters, they were terrifying predators. Alongside them lived bizarre sharks with unusual shapes, such as the helicoprion, famous for its spiral jaw of teeth. These strange creatures showed just how experimental evolution could be during these ancient times. The oceans before sharks were never quiet. They were stages for one terrifying predator after another. From Anomalocaris in the Cambrian, to orthocones in the Ordovician, to placoderms like Dunkleosteus in the Devonian, each age had its ruler, its monster that dominated the seas. Sharks were always there, lurking in the background, but not yet ready to take control. Their moment was still to come. For now, the ancient oceans belonged to armored fish, shelled cephalopods, and monsters that defy imagination. This was the first age of ocean monsters, a time when evolution was still experimenting, creating bizarre predators that would one day give way to the sleek and deadly sharks we know today. In the next part, we will explore what happened after the fall of the placoderms, and how sharks began to rise while still facing terrifying rivals that ruled the seas before them. The fall of the armored placoderms at the end of the Devonian created a vacuum in the oceans. For millions of years, Dunkleosteus and its relatives had dominated the seas with their bony armor and crushing jaws, but when they disappeared, nature had to fill the empty throne of apex predator. Sharks were present, but they were still relatively small and primitive. The path to dominance was not immediate. Before sharks rose to the top, other ocean monsters stepped forward to rule the waters. The Carboniferous period, beginning about 359 million years ago, was one of the most remarkable ages in ocean history. It was a time when life exploded in variety, not only on land but also in the sea. Strange sharks appeared, but they looked nothing like modern ones. Instead of sleek torpedo bodies and sharp triangular teeth, many of these early sharks were bizarre experiments of evolution. One of the most famous examples is helicoprion, a shark with a circular whorl of teeth in its lower jaw, like a buzzsaw stuck inside its mouth. Scientists long debated how this spiral worked. Some thought it extended out like a saw blade, others believed it rolled inside the mouth. Today, most agree that it sat curled within the jaw, and when helicoprion bit into prey, the spiral would rotate, slicing flesh and dragging it backward into the throat. Helicoprion grew up to 25 feet long and was a frightening predator of squid-like animals. Another strange carboniferous shark was Stethecanthus, which had a flat, anvil-shaped dorsal fin covered in denticles that looked like tiny teeth. The function of this fin remains mysterious. Some believe it was used for display to attract mates, while others think it played a role in combat or intimidation. Either way, Stethecanthus showed that sharks were experimenting with new designs, though they were not yet the perfected hunters we see today. While these sharks prowled the oceans, they did not yet rule them. In shallow waters, eurypterids, the giant sea scorpions, continued to dominate. Some species stretched more than 8 feet long, using their claws to grab fish and invertebrates. They were not as common as earlier predators like Dunkleosteus, but in coastal ecosystems they were powerful hunters. Alongside them swam enormous crustaceans and early ray-finned fish, all competing in a dynamic food web where no single group yet controlled the seas. The Carboniferous oceans were also home to massive coral reefs, built by sponges and early corals. These reefs created rich habitats filled with prey, and wherever there is prey, predators follow. Early sharks, ray-finned fish, and lobe-finned fish all thrived, each adapting to the opportunities of this ancient world. But even with all these predators, no single one achieved the global dominance that Dunkleosteus once held. The throne of apex predator was vacant, waiting for the next true ruler. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, around 299 million years ago, the oceans grew even stranger. The Permian was a time of extremes, vast deserts on land, fluctuating sea levels, and new evolutionary experiments in the water. The oceans became home to some of the most bizarre sharks ever to exist. One example was Anomalocaris, also known as the scissor-tooth shark. Instead of a spiral of teeth like Helicoprion, Anomalocaris had curved jaws lined with long, protruding teeth that looked like giant scissors. Unlike modern sharks, Anomalocaris did not shed old teeth. Instead, new teeth grew at the back of the jaw and pushed forward, forcing the older teeth out like conveyor belts. This gave Anomalocaris a terrifying appearance, with long rows of teeth sticking outward in a curved blade. It likely slashed through schools of fish, cutting them apart with sideways sweeps of its jaws. Another Permian oddity was Xenacanthus, a freshwater shark with a long eel-like body and a spine on the back of its head. This spine may have been venomous, giving Xenacanthus a deadly weapon against both prey and predators. Unlike the giants of the open ocean, Xenacanthus lived in rivers and lakes, showing that sharks were beginning to diversify into many different environments. They were not yet kings of the sea, but they were spreading far and wide. While sharks experimented with wild body plans, other groups of predators still held influence. Cephalopods, the relatives of modern squids, cuttlefish, and octopuses, continued to thrive. They were not the straight-shelled giants of the Ordovician anymore, but coiled ammonites and other forms that filled the seas with swirling shells. Some of these ammonites grew massive, and their numbers were so great that they became staple prey for many predators. But they were also hunters themselves, using their tentacles and beaks to catch smaller animals. In the Permian seas, the balance of power was fragile. Sharks, cephalopods, armored fish, and early reptiles all competed in complex food chains. But then, about 252 million years ago, everything changed. The Permian ended with the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, the Great Dying. Around 90% of marine species were wiped out, including most of the bizarre shark forms, many ammonites, and countless fish. Entire ecosystems collapsed. The oceans were left nearly empty, silent graveyards where only a few survivors remained. Yet from this devastation came opportunity. The Triassic period, beginning 252 million years ago, marked the start of a new chapter. As life recovered, new monsters emerged in the oceans, ones that would rule for millions of years before sharks finally claimed the throne. These were not fish, but reptiles. The first great marine reptiles appeared in the Triassic seas, adapting to life in the water after their ancestors had lived on land. Among them were the ichthyosaurs, sleek, dolphin-like reptiles that became fast and powerful hunters. Some grew over 20 feet long and preyed on fish and cephalopods. With their streamlined bodies and strong tails, they were built for speed, rivaling anything in the ocean. Alongside the ichthyosaurs came nothosaurs, semi-aquatic reptiles that looked like a cross between lizards and seals. They hunted fish near the surface, snapping them up with long jaws full of sharp teeth. While not as dominant as ichthyosaurs, they were important predators in their own right. The Triassic also saw the rise of plesiosaurs, with long necks and small heads, which would later diversify into some of the most famous ocean reptiles of all time. These reptiles changed the rules of ocean dominance. For the first time, large vertebrates ruled the seas instead of armored fish or cephalopods. Sharks still swam among them, but they were overshadowed by these reptilian giants. The throne of apex predator had shifted once again, and sharks would have to wait millions of years before reclaiming it. The Triassic seas marked the beginning of a reptile empire that would last throughout the Mesozoic era. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and later mosasaurs would dominate, growing larger and more specialized over time. Sharks persisted in the background, learning, adapting, and evolving, but they were not yet the masters. The oceans still belonged to the monsters that came before. In the next part, we will explore the rise of these great marine reptiles during the Jurassic and Cretaceous, how they shaped the oceans, and how sharks finally began to sharpen their tools for their own age of dominance. The Triassic seas laid the foundation for a new age of ocean rulers. As the world recovered from the Great Dying, marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs, nothosaurs, and early plesiosaurs seized control. For the first time, the ocean's apex predators were not armored fish or bizarre sharks, but reptiles that had returned to the sea after evolving on land. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 150 million years, during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the oceans would become theaters for some of the most incredible monsters Earth has ever known. The Jurassic period, starting about 201 million years ago, saw marine reptiles reach new heights of power. The ichthyosaurs, which began in the Triassic as relatively modest hunters, grew larger and more specialized. Some species, like Shawnosaurus, stretched up to 70 feet long, rivaling modern whales in size. These giants cruised through the oceans, swallowing schools of fish and squid whole. Their streamlined bodies and giant eyes made them excellent deep divers, able to hunt in the dark waters where other predators could not reach. In many ways, ichthyosaurs were the whale equivalents of their time, dominating through sheer size and speed. But they were not alone. This era also gave rise to the classic plesiosaurs. With their long necks and small heads, plesiosaurs like Elasmosaurus could stretch their necks over 20 feet long, weaving them through schools of fish to snap up prey. Their bodies were powered by 4 strong flippers, allowing them to fly through the water like underwater birds. They were not the fastest predators, but they were efficient ambush hunters, using their reach to strike from surprising angles. Another group, the pliosaurs, represented the opposite strategy. Instead of long necks, they had massive skulls and huge jaws packed with teeth. Pliosaurs like Liopleurodon grew up to 40 feet long and were apex predators of the Jurassic seas. With their powerful bite, they could crush other marine reptiles, giant fish, or whatever crossed their path. If ichthyosaurs were like whales and plesiosaurs like stealthy hunters, then pliosaurs were the Jurassic's equivalent of killer whales, brute force predators with no natural rivals. During the Jurassic, sharks still swam the seas, but they were not yet the rulers. They coexisted with the reptiles, hunting smaller prey and filling secondary roles. They were refining their tools, serrated teeth, cartilaginous skeletons for speed, and improved senses. But against giants like Liopleurodon, sharks could not yet compete. As the Jurassic transitioned into the Cretaceous period, around 145 million years ago, the balance shifted again. Ichthyosaurs began to decline, disappearing entirely before the end of the Cretaceous. Plesiosaurs remained, diversifying into both long-necked and short-necked forms. But the true terrors of the Cretaceous seas were a new group of reptiles, the mosasaurs. Mosasaurs were relatives of modern lizards and snakes, but they grew into monstrous marine reptiles, some exceeding 50 feet in length. Unlike the flipper-powered plesiosaurs, mosasaurs used their long, flexible bodies and tails to swim like giant aquatic serpents. Their jaws were double-hinged, similar to snakes, allowing them to swallow prey much larger than their heads. With conical, blade-like teeth, they hunted fish, turtles, plesiosaurs, and even other mosasaurs. The largest mosasaur, Mosasaurus hoffmanii, became one of the top predators of the late Cretaceous oceans. It was so dominant that paleontologists often call it the T-Rex of the seas. Its immense size, powerful bite, and sheer aggression made it nearly unstoppable. For tens of millions of years, mosasaurs reigned as the kings of the oceans, ruling alongside plesiosaurs and giant predatory fish. But even as reptiles dominated, sharks were waiting in the background, evolving into forms more and more like the hunters we know today. By the late Cretaceous, sharks had developed serrated teeth perfect for slicing flesh, and species like Cretoxorina grew up to 20 feet long. This Ginsu shark was a formidable predator, preying on fish and even young marine reptiles. Though not yet the undisputed rulers, sharks were clearly preparing for their rise. Then, 66 million years ago, disaster struck again. The asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs also devastated the oceans. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and many other marine reptiles vanished overnight. The mighty reptiles that had ruled for over 180 million years were gone. For the first time since the Devonian, the seas had no reptilian overlords. The throne was empty once more. And this time, sharks seized it. In the aftermath of the extinction, sharks diversified rapidly. Without giant reptiles to compete with, they spread into every niche of the ocean. Some grew massive, like the ancestors of the great white shark. Others specialized as filter feeders, like early relatives of the whale shark. For the last 66 million years, sharks have ruled the seas as the top predators, evolving into hundreds of species that dominate nearly every marine environment. When we look back, the story of ocean monsters before sharks is one of constant change. Each era brought new rulers, new adaptations, and new experiments in evolution. First came the invertebrate giants like Anomalocaris. Then the shelled cephalopods like the orthocones. Next, the armored titans of the Devonian, the placoderms like Dunkleosteus. After them, bizarre sharks of the Carboniferous and Permian, followed by the reptilian empires of the Mesozoic, the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, and finally, the mosasaurs. Sharks were always there, waiting, evolving in the shadows. They survived every extinction, every competitor, every monster that came before. And when the last of the reptilian giants vanished, sharks finally had their moment. Today, sharks are the inheritors of an ancient legacy. They are not just predators, they are survivors, shaped by 500 million years of competition with some of the strangest and most terrifying creatures Earth has ever known. Every shark swimming in the ocean today carries that history in its genes, a history written in the rise and fall of the monsters that ruled before them. And while humans now pose the greatest threat to sharks, it is worth remembering, for hundreds of millions of years, the oceans have belonged to monsters. From trilobite hunters to armored giants, from sea scorpions to serpentine reptiles, each had their reign, and each eventually fell. The sharks, however, endured. And as long as the seas exist, it is likely that sharks, the ultimate survivors, will remain the true heirs to the throne of the ocean.